Good evening and welcome to the 42nd edition of the Archives Public Lecture Series. For those of you who are new to this forum, the Archives at NCBS is a public center for the history of contemporary biology in India. The lecture series is one of the programming activities of the Archives, which was started in 2018. They are framed around discussions in and around archives, and in the past, we've hosted discussions by artists, archivists, academics, and many others, drawing from their vast body of work and service. To know more about the archives and all of the previous talks we've had, please check out the links in the chat window. We have with us today two members from the Metromod team, Rachel Lee and Mareike Hetschold. Their collective expertise spans art history, urban histories, literature, and Italian. A very warm welcome to you both, and we're very glad to have you here. Their talk is titled In Digital Exile, Narrating Urban Histories, and it focuses on the Metromod project. Metromod is a fascinating project at the intersections of urban studies, art history, and exile studies. In particular, it focuses on 6 metropolitan cities between the 1900s and 1950s and explores how art history was characterized by movement, connections, networks, and flows of people and ideas between these cities and across borders. We look forward to this talk, and over to you, Rachel.
Thank you very much, Sanjana, for the lovely introduction. And also thank you to Venkat for inviting us to take part in this lecture series. And it's a real pleasure for Mareike and me, as well as Laura Karp Lugo, who unfortunately can't be with us here, so to say, live in the presentation because she's taking a flight to Mexico today. And so she's very much part of the presentation though, and I shall be reading the parts that she contributed. So yeah, I hope I can do my best to channel Laura's very beautiful Argentinian spirit while making a big mess of pronouncing Spanish words, no doubt. Anyway, so it's quite interesting that I met Venkat quite a long time ago. He said 3.5, 4 years ago, in a connection to my earlier research project around my PhD, which was on the German Indian British architect Otto Königsberger. And he worked as the chief architect of Mysore state from 1939 until 1948. I'm going to start sharing my screen because we do have a presentation here. Oh, excuse me. Present. Yeah, so here's Otto Königsberger. So he was the chief architect of Mysore state from 1939 until 1948, and then the director of housing in the first independent Indian government from 1948 to 1951. And he designed several buildings, including this one that you see on the right, the Dining Hall Auditorium at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore. And it's also intriguing that the project that we are going to discuss today, Metromod, is connected to the National Center for Biological Sciences, as it is part of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. And as you'll see later in the talk, and on this slide here, the TIFR is actually featured in our project. So to begin with, I'm going to introduce the Metromod project as a whole, our sort of approach and what we are trying to do with it. And then we'll move more into the digital outputs that we've been working on over the past 3 or 4 years and discuss them also in terms of archives. So Metromod, Relocating Modernism, Global Metropolises, Modern Art and Exile, to give it its full name, is a research project funded by the European Research Council and based at the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich, Germany. It's a 5-year project that began in June 2017. As well as supporting the principal investigator, Burcu Dogramaci, Metromod includes positions for 2 postdocs and 3 PhDs. Laura, who is on her way to Mexico at the moment, and I were both postdocs. And we are both now have jobs in different cities. So we're no longer based in Munich. I'm at the TU Delft, and Laura is at an art school in Nancy in France. And Mareike, who's with us today, is working on her PhD. The rest of the team includes Helena Roth, Ekaterina Aigun, and Mareike Schwartz, and we have administrative support from Christina Lagau. So as you may be able to surmise from the 4 names, it's an all-female project, which is maybe interesting in itself. Starting from the premise that migration is constitutive of cities, while cities also shape people, the project explores a particular type of migration, exile, and it focuses on cross-border relocations of a particular group of people, artists, architects, and intellectuals, in 6 cities: New York, Buenos Aires, London, Istanbul, Bombay, and Shanghai, you can see on the map, during a particular period, the first half of the 20th century. This era encompasses unprecedented mass migration movements, as well as phases of return or remigration. For numerous artists who fled their native countries due to changes in political systems, dictatorships and wars, repression, persecution, and violence, these cities were places of entrance, transition, and creativity. The cities were changed by the presence of exiled artists, and vice versa. The urban topographies shaped the actions and interactions of the artists. The changes caused by migration are visible in these cities. Their urban topographies contain neighborhoods, places, and spaces that were populated, frequented, and run by migrants. In addition to providing the émigré artists with income, employment, and exposure, urban institutions, academies, associations, museums, and galleries were crucial settings for interaction and exchange between the local and migrant populations. In some cases, they were founded and run by émigré artists. The numerous exhibitions curated by and including the work of these artists were also connected to specific sites and spaces in the urban fabric, as were the circulation of media and dissemination of discourse pertaining to them. In their stations of exile and their final destinations, the émigré artists attempted to continue their artistic production, to build up new networks for their art, as well as collaborations and exhibitions between exiled and local artists and artist groups. But it should be considered that certain neighborhoods not only often became home to large numbers of migrants, but that they also supported segregation and isolation. So there were inspirational and conflict-laden encounters. En route and within these cities, new theoretical concepts were developed and elaborated upon, pushing the boundaries of art theory and practice. So as well as publishing articles, the Metromod project has already produced 1 book, which you can see here on the left. It's called Arrival Cities, Migrating Artists and New Metropolitan Topographies in the 20th Century. But today, we're not so much focusing on our book and article production, but on other outcomes of a more digital nature. These are hosted on our website, metromod.net, that you can see on the right, and will be discussed in more detail in the following. So, within the Metromod project, as I mentioned, we work on the relationship between exile, city, and artistic creativity. Our second book, Urban Exile, Theories, Methods, and Research Practices, which will be coming out in the fall of 2022, focuses on this interweaving, which happens to be essential when working on the exile of artists in global metropolises. One of the methodological contributions of this volume directly engages with one of the central questions of historical research: the relationship between intellectual or artistic life and migration in mid-century societies. The idea is to apply the methodological frameworks of spatial history, as they are uniquely positioned to mine and activate issues of artistic agency in and through cities. Refusing to posit space as a universal category, Historians engaged in spatial methods. Historians engaged in spatial methods promote a conception of space as contingent on political, economic, and cultural conditions. This dimension is exemplified, for instance, by Henri Lefebvre's famous dictum, "Social space is a social product," he said in 1974. Born in the wake of the 1970s, alongside developments in cultural history, the spatial turn in history offers a way to understand the past. It allows us to grasp the ways in which both built environment and mapping strategies serve as a context within which a range of political entities, from the body to the neighborhood, can be reconsidered vis-a-vis a historical methodology. Understanding the city, its urban space, and the places in which the exiles evolved led us to reconstruct their trajectories. Indeed, a spatial method applied to the study of how art is created within the context of exile reveals itself to be particularly promising for overcoming the difficulty of locating artistic expression of or in exile, which can be somehow difficult to grasp in its material forms. While they may be considered oppositional to the project of historiographical spatial history, material sites and cities and the imaginary projections attached to them can address one of the most important problems of historical research in art history, especially when it deals with exilic artistic production in the 20th century, that of sources. Indeed, focusing on both geographical sites and imaginary spaces allows us to overcome the paradox of exilic artistic production, which sometimes leave ephemeral material traces that may be difficult to grasp today. As Paul Stock posits, spatial methods can reveal issues that render the boundaries between material and representation more porous. Such methods allow us to address the relation between material environment and intellectual life. As such, we draw on a historical approach that further develops the study of material space. Buildings, hotels, cafes, and publishing houses are considered as some of the most important 20th century sites where intellectual life flourished. This allows us to analyze major artist networks and even some of the artworks that have survived from that time. These reflections on exile go beyond the discipline of architecture and art history, insofar as our approaches and methods can be mobilized for the research of exile studies in general. When it comes to exiles, the sources scholarship depends on, such as historical documents, letters, photographs, personal writings, and so on, remain particularly fragmentary, sometimes even wholly untraceable. There are many reasons for the dispersal or disappearance of such sources. Quick and sometimes unexpected departures, the need to reduce the amount of luggage for crossing by ship or by air, or multiple changes of residence before finding a more permanent place to live. When the exiles had just arrived, they often didn't know the city or didn't have sufficient resources to choose a suitable place to stay. It is exactly this moment in the lives of artists, when they arrive, when they leave, when they look for a network which they might fit into, that offers a rich source for understanding individual artists' strategies of enduring and even flourishing in new environments. If personal sources are not preserved, an important part of the research is compromised. When these artists manage to settle down permanently and comfortably, the role of the migrant or local networks tends to diminish. And although personal sources are usually best preserved at this stage of the exiles' lives, they are often of a different nature and don't reflect the key issues of the arrival and integration period. Faced with this paradox, by reading the city as a source for research on exile and art, we sought to propose a possible methodological approach to fill in as many gaps as possible left by incomplete or missing sources. Starting with addresses, maps, and places, it is possible to follow the trail of artists in urban space. The encounters, the places they frequented, the neighborhoods that were familiar to them, and that marked their daily lives as much as their production. As an example of trajectories and networks that can be constructed from addresses and through an analysis of urban space, let's mention the Austrian artist Gertrudis Chalet, who arrived in Buenos Aires in 1934. She settled in the suburb of Quilmes, a neighborhood in the south of the city, and quickly integrated into the Metropolises' artistic and intellectual milieu, joining a group of artists and intellectuals made up both of Europeans and Argentinians. But why Quilmes, a neighborhood that was 20 kilometers away from the city center? An analysis of the existing historical structures in the city can help us to answer this question. Indeed, when Chalet arrived in Quilmes, there was an important German community that had developed around the Cerveceria Quilmes, the Quilmes brewery, founded by German immigrant Otto Bemberg in 1888. You can see this in the middle of that map. Very soon, facilities were developed to make daily life easier for the workers of the successful brewery, including a sports center and a health service. Nearby, the German Club of Quilmes was founded in 1923. Many German-speaking immigrants settled in Quilmes, so they were mostly from Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and they were attracted by the job opportunities offered by the Quilmes brewery. There was also the Holmberg Deutsche Schule, known as the German School, which had opened in 1898. Undoubtedly, the German-speaking environment had attracted German, Swiss, and Austrian exiles to the city of Quilmes, including Gertrudis Chalet. So I'm going to pass over to Mareike now.
Yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about our first digital project we launched this year in July, our walks. We created 6 thematic walks through the Metromod cities, and via a route that includes 10 stops located on a contemporary city map, the historical urban settings become tangible in the current metropolitan topographies. We tried to enhance the digital walking experience by including different media formats such as text, images, and also audio files, and a pleasant design. The objective was to practice and materialize our theoretical approaches and to connect historic sites of exilic artistic production, to trace the migration of ideas, and to situate exchanges between locals and migrants. Each walk addresses diverse topics, such as the first footsteps of German-speaking immigrant photographers in New York, the alteration of the cityscape and the establishment of institutions and meeting places by immigrants in Buenos Aires, various artistic contact zones and the struggles for artistic recognition in London, specific neighborhoods and locations that became key sites for painters, sculptors, and photographers in Istanbul, transcultural dialogues and plural networks in Bombay, and the conditions of urban modern warfare and artistic practices in Shanghai. As this very briefly presented range of thematic approaches might illustrate, we have endeavored to let the cities and their specific urban settings act as one of the main narratives of the walks. Preceding the publication of the digital online archives, which I will also shortly introduce in a moment, the walks offer an obviously narrated and cohesive way to approach our 6 Metromod cities and their historical layers. Ultimately, the question remains to what extent historical and contemporary urban perceptions and their interpretations can be successfully combined into something new and hopefully insightful, which brings me to the next point of the presentation, our digital online archive, which has been published shortly after the walks on our website. Also, the archives address our 6 Metromod cities individually. The entries are connected to addresses located or estimated as coordinates on a contemporary city map. We decided to organize the entries in 4 main categories: in persons, objects, events, and organizations. Unlike the walks, the archive has not such a strict predefined hierarchical order. Nevertheless, you have to navigate through different layers, from a macro to a micro level. Once you have chosen an entry, you will see that each entry is linked to other entries within the city, but in some cases also across the city or around the globe. You can navigate the archive and the entries in different ways, via the globe or by choosing the name of the city above. On the next level, there is a simple search function. You can enter via the city map by choosing one of the symbols that represent the 4 main categories, or by choosing the first of the cards you see here. You can proceed to dive deeper into the archive by scrolling through and choosing one of the cards, and then finally you are also able to navigate via the cross-references that interlink various entries of various categories and cities. The archive's architecture is facilitated by a dynamic CMS database called NodeGoat, programmed by Gert Kessels and Pim van Bree from Lab 100 in Den Haag. The database allows us to create cross-references and to analyze datasets in relation to space and time, or as it has already been mentioned on a conceptual level, to create a tool that allows us to engage with issues that render the boundaries between material and representation more porous, and to address the relation between material, environment, and intellectual life. The database also provides social network and map-based visual analysis. The design of the archive and the walks was created by Jamal Busha from Büro Johannes Erler in Hamburg. The overall objective was to create an interactive map of creative exiles between 1900 and the 1950s that includes, beside prominent protagonists, also less acknowledged or known persons. The content creation is nevertheless based on a Eurocentric perspective and considers mainly, but not exclusively, German-speaking migrant and exiles. We understand the building process of the archive as a selective and therefore curated process, which has not been completed yet and which is not meant to be representative. According to this, and analogous to the concept and content of the digital walks, each of the city archives has a specific thematic approach. While the Istanbul archive's focus, for example, is twofold, it presents Russian-speaking artists who have been compelled to leave their homes after the revolution in the 1920s, as well as German-speaking architects and artists who fled the Nazi regime in the 1930s and 40s. The New York archive, however, mainly focuses on German-speaking exiled photographers. While, for example, the exiled communities featured in the London archive are rather homogeneous in biographical regards, the Buenos Aires, Shanghai, and Bombay archives are conceptualized around diverse population structures in urban settings in semi-colonial context or colonial context. As I already mentioned, we would like the database and the archive to help us to map and analyze interurban networks and to address research questions around exile from a spatial, respective, urban, and also comparative perspective. These questions could be, for example, how and to what extent did the exiled artists and the intellectuals engage with their new urban environment and the local population, or how did the specific urban settings and conditions impact their artistic practices and careers, just to name some obvious questions. Finally, I would like to outline that the archive is a collaborative project. Some of the city archives, notably Shanghai and Bombay, feature entries written by external and also local authors, which contribute to a plurality of voices and perspectives. As already mentioned, the archive is a work in progress, and we would be grateful to receive hints, helping with missing information, and we would very much like to encourage researchers to get involved with us. Looking at the different compositions of the individual city archives not only reveals how decisive the place of exile or the city is for the respective exile experience, but also point to the different challenges that the researchers encounter today. Depending on the topic, time, and place of research, one is confronted with a range of limitations. The different accessibility and availability of information on biographies and artifacts, on public and private archives, on research, literature, and sources. In my case, for example, I must deal with and acknowledge language barriers, and we all have made our experience with ongoing travel restrictions. These heterogeneous problem constellations entail different methods and approaches to the research areas. But the city itself, the transmission of its stories, its perception, and the quality of its topographical and demographic transformation processes over time also have an impact on the respective research possibilities, methods, and concepts. Let's take Shanghai as an example. It is well known that Shanghai has undergone a massive transformation in recent decades, and my ability to accurately track the changes in urban structures is not exactly seamless. Nevertheless, some historic urban topography has been preserved, especially in the districts of the former French concession. And yet, not only because many historical addresses of interest are not located in these districts, but their localization on a contemporary map is also sometimes like a guessing game. While the historical street names are mostly known, the logic of the house numbers, for example, are often not. Sometimes nothing remained of the little streets and alleys that formerly formed residence complexes. To achieve the closest possible approximation to the former location, it is helpful to compare various historical maps with contemporary maps and to reconstruct the course of the house numbers piece by piece. For example, with the help of buildings that still exist and whose old addresses are known. Photographs or even pictures with which, if you're lucky, show the destination addresses are also very helpful. Painted or photographed city views can provide information about the building density of a street. This in turn helps to better access the current location of historic house numbers. Sometimes you can also find descriptions of the location of addresses in diaries of former residents or tenants, or as drawings on business cards. In the case of Shanghai, I have identified most of the addresses from historical newspapers, advertisement, and diary entries. This is an entirely different situation than, for example, in New York, and therefore involves different methods. Pass over to Rachel again.
Thank you. The Metromod project was funded through the European Union, which has recently begun to stipulate that project outputs should be open access and available to anyone, as well as our first open access book publication, which was a typical academic outcome. It was basically the result of a conference that we held. We felt it was necessary to produce content and outputs that would engage wider publics, including people who live in the 6 cities and are interested in local urban history. While language is clearly an issue here, the website that we have is only in English. With the walks and the archives, we attempted to create formats that were more journalistic playful, and multisensorial than research outcomes often tend to be, and are hopefully also attractive and appealing to more people, especially in contexts where few sources are available in printed or digital format, as Mareike just mentioned. And Mareike and I would sometimes stare longingly at the piles of books that Borju and Helena had on their desks about exile in London and New York, and even specifically on exiled photographers in New York, while we were struggling to find printed sources, like any printed sources. We felt that publishing the archives and walks was an opportunity to present material that we had collected to future researchers who might be interested in taking up the topics we have begun to explore. We also hoped that the walks would enable people to engage with the exile histories within the cities themselves, allowing their smartphones to guide them through the streets, and perhaps adding an extra layer of embodied meaning to the historical narratives that we present. Yeah, so now we're going to go and show you some examples of the walks and the archives in more detail. And the first one is Buenos Aires, which was Laura's city. So the old district of Buenos Aires, with the central zone located in Florida Street, Calle, Florida, functioned as a contact zone where a rich artistic life developed. It featured galleries, shops for artists' equipment, photography studios, institutions, and different associations. In this street and its surroundings, local and migrant artists gathered, exchanged ideas, and exhibited their work together. Moreover, European migrants were to be found among the city's successful merchants, bar owners, but also gallerists and members of many liberal professions such as writers, artists, and architects. The mutual aid networks of European immigrants in Buenos Aires had a significant impact on the art scene. Some migrants set up as art dealers. Jose Artal, Jose Pinelo Lul, and Justo Bo Alvaro, Spanish merchants, worked hard to make visible the art produced in Buenos Aires by their compatriots. In the same way, German gallerists exhibited their compatriot artists. This is what enabled Grete Stern to have her first solo exhibition at the Müller Gallery in 1943, for example. The gallery's owner, Federico C. Müller, was born in Wiesbaden in Germany in 1878. And after spending time traveling within Europe, in Paris, Barcelona, and London, for example, he emigrated to Buenos Aires. In 1909, he opened a shop of decorative objects in Calle, Florida, 361. You can see this on the map here, marked red, the lower arrow. In the basement, in a dimly lit room, he exhibited artworks, sometimes old paintings, sometimes works by modern German artists. This changed in 1910 when he was asked by the German government to curate a German section at the International Exhibition of Fine Arts of the centenary of Argentinian independence, the Revolución de Mayo. After that, in 1912 and 1913, he organized exhibitions of German painting in the German Club of Buenos Aires. Then, in 1913, he decided to move to a better place in the same street, to Florida 935, which you can see is further north, where the other main Argentinian galleries were located. For example, Whitcomb and Van Riel, among many others. After that, Müller focused his activity on exhibitions of fine arts, presenting mainly German artists. By 1914 or 1915, due to the difficulty of obtaining German and more generally European works in the context of World War I, Müller also opened his gallery to other nationalities. Most of the time, he personally selected the artists and artworks he exhibited, but sometimes he let the space out to other gallerists. In 1954, the gallery closed permanently. A few meters away from Müller's gallery, facing the Sociedad Fotográfica Argentina de Aficionados, the Argentine Photographic Society of Amateurs, founded by Francisco Ayerza in 1889 in Cay, Florida 365, the English photographer Alejandro Whitcomb had opened an exhibition space in 1897. Before moving to Cay, Florida 900, a large gallery with a glass ceiling. Whitcomb sought to attract an affluent audience, the upper class of Buenos Aires. In 1911, Cay, Florida became pedestrianized and commercialized, linking the central district to Retiro in the north. Shops, galleries, and studios multiplied on either side of Cay, Florida, which was and still is one of the city's most central and well-known streets. One of those galleries belonged to Franz van Riel, who was born in Rome in 1879 and disembarked in Buenos Aires in 1910. After having worked for several years as a magazine illustrator, in 1913, he eventually opened a photography studio in Cay Viamonte between Maipú and Florida. In 1924, he moved down to Cay, Florida 659 and opened a gallery. There, artists and intellectuals gathered, to shift the slide, as the gallery hosted not only the Asociación Amigos del Arte, which was a popular association among artists, but also the magazines Ver y Estimar, edited by the Argentinian art critic Jorge Romero Brest, and Augusta, founded by Van Riel, together with the Argentinian writer and journalist Manuel Rojas Silveira. In 1950, when Van Riel died, the gallery passed into the hands of his son. Those galleries were grouped together on Cay, Florida, because the street constituted a strategic metropolitan connecting line and axis. Since the birth of Buenos Aires, Florida had acted as the nodal point for the social life of the city. In the days of independence, salons were held there, including those of Mariquita Sanchez and Flora Asquenaga, which gathered together local and foreign elites. Located about 400 meters from the Rio de la Plata, which opens out to the Atlantic Ocean, Florida rises parallel to it until it merges into Plaza San Martin, which also faces the river in its northern part. At the turn of the 20th century, many other establishments were located there too, such as Galeria Londres, Salon Chandler y Thomas, Jockey Club, Galeria Philippon, Salon Eclectique, as well as the most prestigious commercial buildings, Galerías Pacifico, Galeria Güemes, Galeria Jardin, Harrods, and Confiteria Richmond, among many others. Clustered on this 1.3 kilometer long pedestrian street, art galleries, shops, clubs, and associations could expect a consistently high number of shoppers, visitors, aficionados, and flaneurs. This stimulating social and professional environment led the artists of Buenos Aires to practice forms of self-organization by setting up societies and associations, and by opening private spaces where they could gather. So I'm going to pass back to Mareike now, who's going to introduce the Shanghai Walk, and I'm also going to shift to the website itself.
Yes, and hopefully it will work.
Yes.
Yes.
So roll down to Shanghai.
That is. Thank you. The Shanghai Walk roughly follows a route taken by the German Jewish refugee and theater maker and journalist Alfred Dreyfus. On board the Conte Verde, he landed on Shanghai's riverbanks in June 1939. 4 months later, in an article entitled Broadway Melody, he remembers his arrival while walking from the Bund into the heart of Little Vienna, later to be known as the so-called Shanghai Ghetto. If you see, stop a moment. Can you show us the card again, Rachel? Yeah, just to have a bit of orientation. The point number 1 of this card is located, the map is located on the board at the Bund, and number 10 and 9, there is these, it's a district of Hongkou, and there was the former Shanghai Ghetto. Yeah. His text was found in the Dreyfus archive in Berlin, and now it is brought to life by the actress Luana Feliz at the Residenztheater in Munich. It is a suggestive text that offers the possibility of artistic alienation and has been given a female voice. We can maybe just listen to a few words of the audio file.
Broadway Melody. Auf dem Schiff hörte ich zum ersten Male davon, dass es in Shanghai eine Straße geben soll, die Broadway hieße. Broadway, das habe ich doch schon öfters gelesen. New York, Wolkenkratzer, Vergnügungsstraße, Menschen und Autogedränge. Irgendwo hat man das doch schon mal im Kino gesehen. Ob das in Shanghai auch so sein wird? Nein, ganz so war es nun doch nicht. Ein Wolkenkratzer stand zwar in pompöser Majestät gleich hinter der Garden Bridge. Ein paar Omnibusse zockelten auch ihres Weges. Ansonsten waren die Lastwagen, die uns Neuankömmlinge in die verschiedenen Heime brachten, die einzigen Fahrzeuge. Und außer ein paar Abendspaziergängern chinesischer und europäischer Herkunft entdeckte ich auch nichts von Menschenmassen.
Yes. The experience of exile is different for each gender, as are the ways of moving through the city. Thus, the fact that women decided to work as waiters in bars and nightclubs caused some public discussion in the European Jewish community in Shanghai. The discussion was mainly led by male writers in the Shanghai Exile press. As you noticed, the text is unfortunately not yet available in an English translation, but maybe it was also nice to just follow the melody of the language. Dreyfus describes the changing urban landscape and its population, the climate, the smells and sounds of his surroundings. His sensual perception is layered with memories of what has been left behind and with unfulfilled expectations, with reflection of his exile conditions and with thinking towards an uncertain future. His text touches trajectories of urban and cultural imaginaries, collapsing and transforming while dealing with the unknown. The route presented here, compiled more than 80 years later, takes not only into account his perspective, but also other sides related to art and exile, while tracing their remaining fragments that have defied the immense transformation of the city. While walking, Dreyfus crosses different city districts, which were controlled by different powers. The route starts in the former international settlement and ends in Hongkou, which was one of the first urban areas to be occupied by the Japanese. These territorial and constantly changing borders had a great impact on the artistic production of the city and its inhabitants. Surviving exile in Shanghai was a challenge. Besides the growing limitation of mobility and intensifying hostilities, basic needs such as nutrition, healthcare, and housing were not guaranteed. And of course, artistic supply was a rare and precious commodity, as well as working opportunities in the creative industry. In this regard, the stops of the walk are also dedicated to the limited possibilities of artists and creatives who withstood the difficult circumstances. Yes.
Okay, so just to give you an idea of the Shanghai Walk, I'm just scrolling through the different stops on the walk, and as you can see, there's quite a lot of different material available on the website that relates to buildings and sites, as well as to publications and artistic production too. And we hope that with this format of having some fixed images and some that move around, it also sort of connects to the wider theme of exile and instability and chance encounters and so on. Okay, I'm going to finish now with showing you the TIFR stop on the Bombay Walk, which you may have already seen, but if not, here it is. I think it is this one. Yeah, so one of the priorities that we had in the project that was also an attempt to get away from this Eurocentric perspective that Mareike mentioned earlier was to include as much as we could about the existing local art scene and the figures that were important in forging that. And so in Bombay, Homi Bhabha was one such figure. And as Homi Bhabha was the founder of TIFR, as many of you probably know, directly connects to your institute. Yes, so originally the TIFR building was established. Well, there was no TIFR building established. Originally, TIFR was at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, and it moved to Bombay in 1945, and it didn't get its own building until the 1960s. And for a long time, it was housed in the Royal Bombay Yacht Club on Apollo Bandar. You can see here's Homi Bhabha, some images of him. I think it is quite significant when your portrait is placed on a postage stamp, no matter that it's only 4 rupees. And there is Homi Bhabha again in the security cabin at the entrance to TIFR in its current site. Yes, so the Royal Bombay Yacht Club is perhaps not the most likely location for an institution like TIFR, because it was a very colonial institution, a European-only one, but yeah, probably in line with what Nehru's vision was for independent India, and Homi Bhabha's own ideas about nation building. It was an opportunity to change the narrative of this colonial building. In this walk, we included quite a lot of audio recordings from various sources and documents relating to the various stops on the walk. For instance, this is an excerpt from Lewis Bromfield's trashy novel called Night in Bombay, which nevertheless does describe lots of places that we encounter on the walk and is an interesting source. I would thoroughly recommend Night in Bombay to those who haven't read it. I'll just play a short excerpt here.
I appreciate your kind invitation, he said, but I never go to the yacht club. I've never been inside. Mr. Smithers looked alarmed. Why not, Mr. Wainwright? Surely it's a fine club. It isn't that. Only, you see, I have a good many Indian friends, some of them very distinguished. And as you know, they are not allowed to enter the club. So
and something that was very unusual, I think, for a publicly funded institution. Well, TIFR was not wholly publicly funded, but the Indian government did step in and contribute funding, was that it had a large budget for purchasing art. And Homi Bhabha was an avid art collector and also an amateur artist. And with the support of his companion, as she is often called, Pipsi Wadia, he amassed one of the most significant collections of Indian modern art worldwide. And really, it's worth visiting TIFR in Bombay to see the art collection. It's very fantastic. Here's an image of Pipsi Wadia and an exhibition that was held at TIFR when it was still located in the Yacht Club. Yes, and so within this collection of artworks, there were also pieces by the exiled artists, including paintings by Walter Langhammer, who I think there's a landscape, and there's also a portrait of Rudy van Leyden titled The Critic. Rudy van Leyden worked with the Times of India as the art critic and was quite heavily responsible for establishing the modern art scene within the city through his presence in the media. And Walter Langhammer was also an important figure in that regard. So the Royal Bombay Yacht Club was always intended to be temporary, while a new purpose-built institution was going to be constructed somewhere else in Bombay. And for me, it was interesting that to begin with, plans were made for TIFR by the exiled architect Otto Königsberger, who I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, who had been the chief architect of Mysore state in the 1930s and 40s, and was a close friend of Homi Bhabha. They had met when both of them were working at the Indian Institute of Science. So Bhabha asked Königsberger to produce plans for the building, which you can see some of them here. And he also asked the Bombay architecture firm Master Satya Bhutta to produce a set as well. And due to copyright reasons, we can't show those on the website, unfortunately. The walk also includes an excerpt from a letter from Homi Bhabha to Otto Königsberger, which is maybe interesting to hear how Bhabha communicated with the architect.
The time has come now when work should be started on the preparation of the detailed plans for the Tata Institute. The Council feel, however, that it would be necessary for you, if you wish to undertake this work, to spend the entire period in Bombay, during which the plans will be prepared. I presume this will take at least a month. The arrangement that you suggested would require constant correspondence between Bangalore and Bombay and greater drain on the time of the members of the Institute than is possible in the present circumstances. Will you therefore let me know if you can arrange to spend at least a month in Bombay during the monsoon? This period may, of course, be split up into periods of a fortnight each. But I do feel that you should spend at least a month in total. We want the plans to be ready by the end of the monsoon so that the building work may be commenced immediately. While I was staying at your house, I put through 2 or 3 trunk calls to Bombay. Will you please let me know what the amount was, as I must pay for them? I am going to Shimla on the 31st for a month's holiday, busman's. I hope I shall be able to make substantial progress on my book during the holiday. My best regards to your mother, HJB.
So, yeah, that recording is definitely from a time when working from home was not possible for Königsberger. And the work did not start in 1947 as was planned. It started much later, and it was not conducted by Königsberger or Master Satya Bhutta, but the Chicago firm of Hollibird and Root, with some input by Achyut Kanvinda, as well as Master Satya Bhutta in the detailing of various spaces within the complex. Yeah, so TIFR, I mean, when you look at the building that was completed, it does have some of the aspects of Königsberger's original design, but it's a very different place altogether and designed for a different site. The site that Königsberger was working on was somewhere near the Sassoon dock, which is not where the building was eventually built. Yeah, and the building was completed with a mural that was part of a competition that was again involved the exiled artists. Von Leyden was one of the judges of the competition for the mural in the TIFR foyer, and it was eventually won by MF Hussein. And yeah, the mural is their pride of place today. So that's the TIFR stop, and it's representative of some of the other stops, at least in the Bombay Walk, in terms of the kind of mix of media that we managed to integrate into the walk with this digital format. And I think I'd like to stop here. Mareike, are you happy with that, or have you got anything else that you'd like to share?
Right.
Okay, so, well, thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Mareike and Rachel. Thank you so much. This was fantastic. I wish we could have more time to just walk through the archive. Folks in the audience, if you have questions, if you're on YouTube, you could put them on the YouTube windows. And if you're here, you could put them into the chat or the Q&A. But I thought I'll just set the ball rolling, Mareike and Rachel, sort of to understand a broader perspective around the archive. I appreciate the lens that you applied early on to say that there are aspects of curation, and you sort of acknowledge the fact that these are not meant to be representative as an archive. But I think that lens that you apply is very unique, and was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you came about the focus for each city. You talked about the intercultural conversations in one city, or the Shanghai in particular about looking at sites during war, or how you looked at sites of congregation as it was in London, if I'm not mistaken. I have to go back and see. So this sort of abstraction that you did by looking at the material, could you tell me a little bit about how that came to be? What came first in the process of coming to these sort of frameworks?
Would you like to start, Mareike? Because I think your focus was quite specific.
Yeah, I think it has something to do if you really look at the urban structure and the city itself, then you will find out that there are differences, and that these differences also impact what took actually place, or what kind of artistic practice took place, how the networks were shaped, and so on. And so I think that these different approaches are also a result of our research with taking the city itself as a source. Yeah, I would say. So yeah, and also we are lucky to have discussions, and we can we talk about our cities and what we find interesting, or what is really special about the city. And so we have always also a comparative perspective, so maybe that is also I would say a benefit.
Yeah, and I think we were quite committed to this comparative perspective from the beginning of the project. That's why we set the project up in the way we did with these 6 cities around the world. And we were, with the database that NodeGo provided, we were really hoping to find links and connections and shared themes between the cities. And to some extent, we did that. There are connections between New York and Bombay and Shanghai. But at the same time, the experiences of each city were very, very specific, I think, for the people who were exiled in them. Like the artists who were exiled in Bombay had a much easier time of it. I would say, generalizing rather here. Wasn't the case for all of them, but for many of them, They managed to access. They had access to existing institutions like the Times of India, for example, through their work that allowed them to be very active and impactful, and to continue their practices even in a different form. But in other locations, like in Shanghai, it was much tougher for the artists to establish themselves because the economic and political conditions were very, very different. And I think, very different in all of the cities. So that's reflected in the ways that we chose to focus the curation of the walks and the archives too.
I'm glad you brought that point up about Bombay, because I was going to ask you, I don't know if the other cities you found a similar story, but the fact, I mean, especially at least the case of TIFR, where there's this unique situation of a certain budget allocation, which I have always been very intrigued by, because that's in effect state funding towards art. I mean, of course, it's facilitated by these very strong networks that TIFR's director has with the government at the time. And, you know, taken at a more abstract level, I guess it is just effectively, if we think about it, it is state funding towards an artist in exile, if we extrapolate this conversation further. So I was just curious to know if other cities or other centers that you had looked at, or maybe centers that did not make the archive, were there examples of where the state came forward and sort of stepped up in other ways at all?
I think in the case of Istanbul, for example, or Turkey more generally, perhaps not Istanbul particularly, I think it was more in the case of Ankara, but the Turkish government was very proactive in recruiting what they called experts in architecture and urban planning, because they'd already embarked on a nation building process, right? And they were looking for input from foreign expertise, and took advantage of the situation that was arising in Central Europe and in Germany and Austria in particular, and really actively engaged architects who were looking to leave Germany. So there's quite a lot of exiled architects who found work in Turkey and were really able to expand their practice, and probably even had more opportunities than they would have if they had not been confronted with the rise of fascism in Europe. But that's the one that springs to mind. I don't know, Mareike, you think of?
Yeah, in Shanghai, I mean, probably the most what was it? Okay, probably the most famous exiled architect is Richard Paulik, and he followed a friend a German architect called Rudolf Hamburger to Shanghai. And he was involved in the city planning, and he became the head of the city planning department, which was newly funded. And of course, the situation in Shanghai is a bit different, because it was after the founding of the People's Republic, they had to leave again. So, and they didn't realize these plans in this way. So, but maybe this would be an example.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. I saw Tanisha had a question in the chat, and Tanisha, I don't know if you're able to go ahead and unmute and ask the question directly.
Hi.
Go for it.
I had a question about how we could possibly use sort of this historical perspective to compare and contrast the arrival of refugees today to metropolitan cities. Is there anything that we can potentially learn?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Tanisha. Thank you for that. I think that was one of our goals at the beginning of the project, and possibly also why we got funding for it, because it does relate to a current challenge that the world is facing. And I think something that the project has shown is really the importance of social spaces within cities for allowing networks to develop between migrant artists and local artists. So for example, in Bombay, these were quite informal often, and there was a lot of focus on private spaces because public spaces didn't really exist to the same extent as they did, for example, in other cities. But also hotels, the Taj Mahal Hotel and Greens Hotel in Bombay were also important meeting places for exiled artists and local artists, and also exhibition spots. So yeah, we were trying to sort of uncover locations and sort of maybe spatial typologies which seem to encourage the development of networks and support artists, and of course by extension then other groups in their integration and getting involved and establishing themselves in their new homes. And that was one way we thought of doing it. I don't know, Mareike, can you?
Yeah, I'm thinking, yeah, maybe it's also, yeah, that sometimes if you, for example, in Shanghai, the notion of exile or being an exiled person become quite, yeah, you will see that this is difficult to give a really strict definition what it is to be in exile, or what this notion means. And because Shanghai's population growth is based on many people who came from whole China to Shanghai, and yes, and also it is difficult to speak about these. I mean, there were around 20,000 Jewish European refugees in Shanghai at that time, and then to speak about them as exiled persons without considering what the term or notion exile might mean already in the city, and how we can talk about them in context with Shanghai's population. And I think these general thoughts about notions and what it is, maybe what it means to be exiled or to be called an exile, is maybe today also relevant for people, because we have a very we have a kind of definition what that means, which is very much based on our German history and the Nazi history, and we have this exile literature with great authors who wrote about the experience being exiled. But maybe today we have to widen the view on it, and to add more perspectives, maybe also.
Thank you. I saw a comment in the Q&A in the chat that I'll just share for the benefit of YouTube folks, where Mauna talked about also migration from rural sites to metropolitan cities, which might be another sort of lens. And I quote from the Q&A where she talked about perhaps finding more content by exiled artists in ex-colonies, like the one that you've shown for Bombay. Which brings me to, maybe I'll just, in the interest of time, thought I'll wrap with a couple of questions. And I'm always curious about archives, which is what did not enter Metromod? Over the course of your research, there might have been other decisions that you said, it doesn't quite fit the framework of the project. I'm just curious to know if you could share anything around that, maybe cities or maybe particular kinds of ways of looking at it. What would you imagine did not enter the framework? So yeah, I ask this question as someone who thinks about what enters the archive and what doesn't.
Well, originally we had included Prague as one of the cities. And in the end, we decided that we would replace Prague. It sounds so terrible, as if but we had to develop criteria for justifying the choices of the cities that we made. And one of the things that that connects all of the cities is that we did choose is that today they're all categorized as global cities, and like they're in the top tier of this sort of economic performance of cities around the world. So all of the cities are comparable today, and Prague wasn't. And so that was one reason for leaving Prague out. We wanted also to make it as global as possible, and originally we had also hoped to include an African city. However, my knowledge and Burcu's knowledge of exile in Africa was really not substantial enough to make a convincing case for that. And we did approach researchers who had worked on Africa, particularly North Africa in Egypt and so on. But we were also considering South Africa or East African cities too. But we couldn't find enough sources or really material to include in the project proposal to merit the inclusion of an African city, which I very much regret. Yeah.
Yes.
I guess on the bright side, I mean, this is a scalable project. One could imagine it sort of having iterations going forward. And maybe that sort of gets me to this question around, people have appreciated the walks. I'd mentioned someone who'd taken it as well. And I'm curious to know, are there certain expectations or ways in which you would like people to interact or interrogate the archive or the walks? How would you imagine that?
And then Mareike, would you like to go?
Yeah. First of all, we would be very happy if as many as possible people can enjoy it, like that they can have fun, and that, because we try to also include less known persons, that also in this way this material gets more known, and maybe we can find people who know something we don't know, and the best case scenario would be that someone would try to contact us and ask questions or add information or whatever, or just share ideas. And so yeah,
it's true. And that was I was very fortunate about, when was it? It must be 2 years ago now, that I met Meher Marfatia in Bombay, and she has a column in Midday, the newspaper, where she writes about the history of the city. And I had found her column very useful with developing ideas about the history of various buildings that were also connected to our work. And so I had contacted her, and she ended up making a feature of the Metromod project in the Midday newspaper. And on the basis of that, I mean, it has quite a wide readership. We were contacted then by people who had more information about the figures and the places that were mentioned in her article, and also additional information. So that was fantastic. And yeah, that would be really a best case scenario if we could have the archives and the walks produce similar information. Actually, it already happened with the Bombay walk to some extent. I was contacted by somebody else who was even invited to a workshop that we did in Bombay as part of this project back in December 2019, when we could still travel. And she told me that her grandparents had lived at 25 Cuff Parade, which is also the house where Mulkraj Anand and Minette de Silva lived, and she hadn't known this connected history. So yeah, like serendipitous, things like that are fantastic and could really bring us forward. And it's an open format. The walks are maybe a bit more closed, because we did say 10 stops per walk, but the archives can be added to. So there's always the opportunity of adding more of these cards to the archives themselves, on the basis of information that people maybe come up with and even include their own writing.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear that happen. I think in a sense, it's very much a living archive, especially the walk sort of component, which will hopefully feed the archive on the website. There's a project that I remember in San Francisco many years ago where I think they took a particular corner and they would have multiple people narrate their personal connections to a particular corner of the city. And that sort of was a way to sort of build a community archive around a particular location. And so perhaps there are ways in which this could feed into a larger conversation. I will we'll probably wrap up here for the sort of live session. So again, on behalf of the campus and the community here, thank you so much, Mareike and Rachel, for being here. And I do hope people at large will catch this recording and so on and so forth. We'll be able to go on the walks, at least the ones in Bombay, and wherever you travel, you're able to use the Metromod website to look at these cities in new light. So thank you again.